It's now the offseason for the New York Jets, and the focus is on upgrades the team can make in free agency and the draft, especially at the quarterback position. We will take a look at the options on today's mailbag edition of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, January 11th, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you are watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the channel out and help other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is presented by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. Pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on your entry. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. That's prizepicks.com, promo code LOCKEDON. Well, today we have our weekly mailbag show. Each Wednesday we try to do a mailbag with listener questions. Plenty of questions this week about what the Jets will do in the offseason, especially at the quarterback position. So let's begin. Our first question: this season wound up being every bit as disappointing as 2015, but I think Jets fans have a lot to look forward to as long as Joe Douglas is calling the shots. If you look at the free agent veteran quarterback class, it is stocked with former top 5 picks. I would draft a quarterback this year and bring back Mike White, and then get rid of Zach. Jimmy G and Derek Carr seem like a salary cap nightmare. What's your early quarterback opinion? Well, it's very early, and I still am trying to sort through my opinion. I'm still thinking things through because I don't think any of the options are really all that great. Now, the question referenced the 2015 season, talked about the disappointment of 2015. I do think the situation is a little bit different for the Jets than it was back in 2015 because the 2015 Jets, who missed the playoffs by a game, were a team that really was driven by veterans. They had been very active in free agency that year, and all of their signings, almost all of their signings at least, worked out for 1 year, and then they kind of fell off. Everybody got old at once, and essentially the Jets were trying to thread the needle back in 2015. They were trying to bring in some veterans who could stabilize things for maybe 2 to 3 years, and they were hoping that they would draft players who would eventually mature to take over for those veterans. And unfortunately for the Jets, neither of those things happened. The veterans all got old after 1 year. I mean, almost all of them had good 2015s and then horrible 2016s. And the Jets simply did not draft well at all in those years. So I think it's a different scenario this year where the improvement really, I think more than anything, was driven by young players who have been recently drafted by the Jets. So I think there's room for optimism there. Now, we talk about the quarterback's position. In the weeks Mike White was starting, I said it over and over that I was really hoping Mike White would play well enough to, and I really had no illusions that Mike White was ever going to be like the long-term answer, but I hoped he played well enough that he would show you that he could be the option for the Jets in 2023, because it's really tough to see where this is going if Mike White, wasn't good enough. And unfortunately, I think in Seattle, Mike White showed you that he's probably not the guy for even for 2023. So that leaves you with a couple of options. And, I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that there were 3 separate paths the Jets could go down. I think I'm going to amend what I said a couple of weeks ago. So I think there are a couple different ways the Jets could approach this. They could go, now we're going to assume Lamar Jackson's out of the mix. I think until there's actually evidence he's leaving Baltimore, we're going to assume he's not an option. But he could be a separate category himself. Young quarterback who maybe does a little unconventionally, but still franchise level quarterback. So let's leave him out of the mix. There's the option with the expensive veteran. That's the Derek Carr or Jimmy Garoppolo option, and that's a guy who you would probably sign, I would guess, for maybe 2 to 3 years, and essentially he'd be a longer term bridge quarterback. You have your guys who are just there to get you through 1 year. You even sometimes bring in a guy just to get you through a month if you're drafting a rookie. But I think Carr or Garoppolo would command a contract as such that they would probably be here, I would guess, 2 to 3 years. That would be the plan. Now, with them, they do cost more, but you also have a better sense of what you're getting, as long as everybody stays healthy. And I think their past injury history would suggest Carr is more likely to stay healthy than Garoppolo. You know you're getting quality quarterback play. You may not be getting MVP quarterback play, but you know you're getting quality quarterback play. And I guess because of that, that might be the direction I would lean in right now, but I don't feel a ton of conviction at the moment. So I think I'd probably lean in that direction because I understand it's a lot of money. I understand the Jets have a lot of needs, but the Jets need to get quality quarterback play. If the Jets had quality quarterback play, the season would still be happening. The Jets would be playing this weekend if they got quality quarterback play this year. So I might lean towards the Carr or Garoppolo option because while you're not getting great play, the floor is much higher than it is with a lot of the other options. So another option you'd have would be to essentially bring in a backup or two, a guy, a caliber, on the high end, you'd probably be talking Jacoby Brissett. On the lower end, you'd be talking maybe a Gardner Minshew or a Mike White. And you'd essentially try and do what the Jets did late this season. You try, and really, frankly, what they did with Zach Wilson, where you just want to lean into the defense, lean into the run game. Brees is going to be back. This is kind of like maybe a higher risk option because the floor on this type of quarterback is quite a bit lower. And you saw Minshew. You saw if you watch Philadelphia, you saw Minshew's limitations. Although he's a quality backup, and the Jets certainly should have targeted him a year ago over Joe Flacco when he was available in a trade. The Eagles got him for practically nothing from Jacksonville. You have a certain ceiling with these guys. Now you could build because you're not paying these guys as much money. You can build up the rest of your team, and if these guys give you decent play, you could go somewhere. You might have a shot at going somewhere. You could catch lightning in a bottle with one of these guys. So that's another option. Another option would be to draft a quarterback. Which, listen, if you're not getting a proven starter, I keep seeing people say that the Jets are out on first-round quarterback, or they should be out on first or second-round quarterbacks, and that doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. Because, it's one thing if you get Carr or Garoppolo, and even then, I think you should be looking to draft their successor. I still think you should be open to the idea that you draft somebody and you sit him for a year or two before you move on. But if you're not getting a guy who's a proven starter, I have no idea why the Jets should be out on drafting a quarterback in the first or second round. That doesn't mean you just draft the first quarterback that's there. The guy actually has to be good. That's one of the problems the Jets have had in recent years is that they've drafted guys in many situations. I think 09 with Sanchez, I think 18 with Sam, and 21 with Zach. They've drafted guys in part because they put themselves in the position where they felt like they had to draft a quarterback. You don't want to put yourself in that position. So that's why there's a benefit of having a veteran who can provide stability. My bigger point being, I wouldn't just draft somebody for the sake of drafting somebody, but if somebody's good enough at that slot, if somebody's like your top guy, I think you got to take him. If you think that guy can be a good quarterback. So your other option would be to draft somebody. And then there's like kind of options that are hybrid options. Do you bring in a veteran, whether it's a high-end veteran like a Jimmy or a Carr, or maybe even a lower-end option like a Minshew, and you pair them with a rookie? There's also like a scenario where maybe you just decide, you know what? We're going to bring in Jacoby Brissett, and we're going to make a big trade. We're going to just try and upgrade the receiver position and just load this offense with playmakers. We got Brees coming back. We got Garrett Wilson. That's the other option where you just say, you know what, if we get like a stable quarterback who's not going to be as expensive and we just put enough talent around him, we can make it work. So I think those are your options. I would probably at this point, and this is very preliminary, I am by no means committed to this idea, but I think at this point I would probably lean towards the more stable veteran, even if they cost more money, because I think we underestimate. I said this last year with Zach, and when people were talking about, can Zach be an MVP candidate? And I wasn't sure it was realistic, but I think it's this year my goal for Zach was to be just a quality quarterback, a guy who's like a middle of the pack, league average kind of guy. And I think we underestimate how important that can be. You can win with league average. What you cannot win with, unless you're very lucky, is the type of quarterback play the Jets got this year. And just bumping this quarterback play up to league average, I mean, it's going to be a big deal. It's going to make, if Elijah Moore is back, it's going to make him better. If Corey Davis is back, it's going to make him better. All these receivers who don't look so good, with a league average quarterback, they're going to look a lot better. Garrett Wilson looks good no matter who you got, so I don't know how much better he'll look. But the point is that I really think that this is the top priority for the Jets this offseason. You can talk linebacker, I understand. Listen, they got to fix this offensive line. This offensive line is not in good shape, and that is not a good reflection on Joe Douglas, by the way. This offensive line's in bad shape. But I really think the quarterback position has to be the number one priority. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we are going to continue our weekly mailbag show. We'll talk about how much the coaches are to blame for Zach Wilson's struggles, in addition to other topics on the Jets offseason. That's as we continue this Wednesday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by TurboTax. Yep, that time of year is coming up. It's tax season is fast approaching. Well, you should go to TurboTax and don't do your taxes. Meet with an expert who will do them for you. TurboTax experts can relieve you from the stress of taxes and file for you so that you can do not taxes. Show your eyes things that are not taxes. Unpack a moving box of not taxes. Taste not taxes. Sing not taxes a lullaby. Hope not taxes sleeps through the night. Grab a saddle and ride not taxes into the sunset. With TurboTax, an expert will do your taxes from start to finish, ensuring your taxes are done right, guaranteed, so you can relax. It feels good to be done with your taxes, doesn't it? Come to TurboTax and don't do your taxes. Visit TurboTax.com to learn more. Intuit TurboTax. Full service products only. Video meeting while expert does your taxes required. See guaranteed details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by the mobile game Ultimate Football GM. Have you ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM and managing your football franchise? Well, your dream can come true, and this game's definitely for you. Manage every strategic aspect of your team, play through the season, and lead your team to glory. You are responsible for hiring the right coaches and coordinators, trading players, making draft picks, and navigating your franchise through free agency and the draft and all the ups and downs of the season. Maybe you can fix your offensive line better than the Jets have fixed theirs. All of this is in a challenging and realistic game mode. Ultimate Football GM is a completely free and playable offline experience. You can play on the go as you want and when you want to. And Locked On Jets listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using promo code Locked On, all caps, in the game store. Again, that's Locked On in all caps. So make sure to check it out today. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up on the app stores. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms. We continue with our weekly mailbag. Our next question: why are we not putting more blame on coaching in regard to Zach Wilson's development? A coach's job is to put a player into the best position to succeed, but Saleh openly admitted that they aren't rolling Zach out more because they want him to learn how to throw in the pocket. It seems like a bad way for him to develop confidence by putting him into an uncomfortable position. I do know stats may not back up Zach being better by rolling out, but two things to counter that. One, Saleh did mention that as the reason, and two, how many times did he rolled out was the rollout a designed play versus the play breaking down due to Zach getting nervous in the pocket or the pocket actually breaking too fast? If the play actually broke down, then it's understandable that he did not succeed very often. Well, I think the reason that I wouldn't put more blame on coaching in Zach Wilson's development is that I look at Zach Wilson and I just don't see what the strengths are. I mean, fine, you want to excuse the lack of playmaking because the play is breaking down versus the designed rollout. Well, listen, I mean, there were plenty of designed rollouts where Zach Wilson did not do particularly effective either. But where's the evidence that Zach Wilson's good at rolling out? I mean, the other issue is that, and I see this, I see the argument made that Jets need to get him on the move more. They need to roll him out more. They need to do more play action, more RPOs, more no huddle. Every single thing I hear about Zach Wilson is asking him to be put in situations where the reads are simplified. And Saleh is right. If you can't play from the pocket, if you can't make full field reads, you can't play. You're not going to be able to succeed in the NFL. Defenses are going to catch on to you. It's not, if you're not putting stress on the defense by challenging the entire field, defenses will eventually catch up, and you're just not going to have success. Why am I not putting more blame on coaching? Well, again, I just don't see what Zach Wilson does well. I don't see what we lean into here. I think about, and the Jets have given us all a PhD in poor quarterback development. But I think this era of Jets failures with young quarterbacks goes probably to Mark Sanchez. I guess you could argue Kellen Clemens, who they drafted in 2006, but I think it's really Mark Sanchez who was the Jets young quarterback who stepped into the lineup, and ever since that point, they've been trying to make it work with some young quarterback. And I think about Mark Sanchez, and I think about Geno Smith, and I think about Sam Darnold, and now I think about Zach. And of these four, I think Zach has shown me the least. Mark Sanchez showed me things. It may not have, he ultimately was not good enough, but there were things Mark Sanchez showed me he could do. Gino, there were things he did. I think Gino was maybe the number 3 on this list. Sam, there were things he could do. So, I mean, at some point, if you see there are things this guy can do, then maybe you say the coaches let him down. But Zach Wilson, I mean, he came out, he threw 4 interceptions in his second game. It's pretty much been all downhill from Zach Wilson from the very beginning of his career. There just hasn't been a lot of promise. I mean, I've taken you through the numbers many times where, he's at the bottom of the league. He's not just at the bottom of the league. You look at comparable players. It's, the Joey Harringtons of the world, the Kyle Bowlers of the world. Those are the guys who put up comparable numbers. These are like huge. These aren't just busts. These are like mega busts. So I can't blame the coaching staff when Zach Wilson just shown me so little. And fine, you want to say the plays. Well, it wasn't part of the reason the Jets drafted him. Was that his ability to create when the play broke down. So I don't know. I don't think that's a great excuse for Zach. But beyond that, it's not like he's shown a great ability to throw on the run, even when it's been a designed play. So I don't think it's really the coaches' fault. You can blame the coaches to an extent. Now, you want to blame the coaches because they obviously had a stamp of approval that they put. Part of the reason the Jets drafted Zach Wilson is the coaches approved of it. Your team's never going to draft a quarterback number 2 overall if the coaches aren't on board. Now, you want to blame the coaches for that. I think that's a very fair point. But I just haven't seen it. There are some guys who just aren't capable of doing it. And, I spoke about Geno a little bit earlier, Geno Smith, who had a great year with Seattle and is going to be in the playoffs this weekend. I think maybe that experience is a lesson that it's very tempting to overlearn the lessons from Geno, because Geno Smith's career trajectory is not that normal. It's not that normal to fail so early and then bounce back all these years later. And I think that maybe there's a little bit of a perception that now Zach can be like Geno, because clearly Geno could do it. Those situations are the exception. And when you start off a career with like Zach Wilson, it's very hard to turn it around. And I go back to one question. What does Zach Wilson do well? What does he actually do well? Because all of these suggestions people have made about what the Jets should do to alter their offense, these suggestions aren't really taking us to things that Zach Wilson's done well during his young career. So, at some coaching matters, but only to an extent. The player also has to show some propensity to have success, and I don't think we've seen that from Zach Wilson. Our next question, John. One of the early selling points about Joe Douglas was he seemed to prioritize the offensive line, and there was a belief that he had an eye for talent. He's had some bad luck with injuries, but this is a unit that has largely underwhelmed during his tenure. How do you think we approach this area in the offseason? Well, it's an excellent point. Joe Douglas has not been good enough on the offensive line. Now, the offensive line has improved during Joe Douglas's tenure, but relative to the amount of resources that have been thrown into it, it hasn't improved enough. And I think we're to the point where we have to say that. I think that the Jets, it's very bizarre to me how the Jets have not seemed to make any sort of priority to retain Connor McGovern, who's been excellent for 2 years. And they do not, as far as I know, have any sort of internal replacement lined up. It's not like there's some young guy who's been developing who you think you can plug in at the center position next year. I've found it very bizarre how the Jets have just seemed to neglect McGovern because they have issues elsewhere. They've got giant question marks at both tackle positions. And how they handle that, could determine what happens with Elijah Vera Tucker. Vera Tucker is going to be back next year. Do you play him at guard? The Jets may have to play him at tackle. It may be the right move, it may not be, but the Jets are just in such a spot at the tackle position where they're probably going to have to play Vera Tucker at one of the tackle spots. Maybe they bring back Herbig. I would like to see them try and upgrade. I think Herbig's a good backup. I don't know if I'd like him in the starting lineup. I think he was a great find off the waiver wire, but waiver wire guys tend to be depth players. You don't really get a lot of start. John Franklin Myers is an exception. Guys you get off the waiver wire are more depth players. They're not really high-end starters for you typically. So I think they have to try and find another guard. I think you have to hope Laken Tomlinson bounces back. And then I don't know what you do at tackle. It's not a great free agent group. Maybe you have to look to the draft at tackle. It is a tough spot. To be honest with you, I don't know what the Jets are going to do on the offensive line. I think they have to bring McGovern back. Or maybe there's some comparable player out there. But I think that it's a very difficult spot for the New York Jets. I really don't know because, again, this free agent class is not exactly stellar. So Jets have put themselves in a tough spot. That's all I can say. And I think Joe Douglas has not really done that great of a job on the off. There are things Joe Douglas has done well. I don't think I think a year ago I was very happy. I was very optimistic about what he'd done on the offensive line, but the results just have not been there. And I think we're to a point where we have to say Joe Douglas has not been good enough on the offensive line. It's great that he prioritizes it. He certainly, I hate to make the Mike McCagnon comparison because almost anybody would be better than Mike McCagnon, but it's nice that he actually prioritizes the line, and he's built a better offensive line than Mike McCagnon did. The problem, though, is that it's not good enough. Better than Mike McCagnon's a very low bar, and it's just not. You reach a point where it's just not sufficient. Now, as we continue this mailbag edition of the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk more about Zach Wilson. He made some comments that generated headlines this week. Should Jets fans be happy? Should they be upset? Should they be indifferent? Well, I'll give you my thoughts as we continue this Wednesday mailbag edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by PrizePicks. The Jets season may be over, but the NFL season continues. The playoffs are coming up this weekend, and you can still play daily fantasy. And let me tell you how PrizePicks works. You pick 2 to 5 players. If they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on any entry. There's no competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. And PrizePicks offers projections on any sport you want to watch. So if you're done with the NFL for this year, you can go with the NBA, the NHL, men's and women's college basketball. You can go with tennis, MMA, boxing, and even disc golf. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. It's that easy. They have safe and fast withdrawals, and they are currently operational in over 30 states and in Canada. So download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com and sign up to play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. So if you deposit $50, PrizePicks gives you another $50. If you deposit $100, PrizePicks gives you $100. And don't forget to enter promo code LOCKEDON at sign-up for an instant deposit match of up to $100. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on our Wednesday mailbag show. Our next question: Did you find it offensive that Zach Wilson made a comment that he would make life heck for any veteran brought in to compete with him? Isn't the concept for Wilson to learn from the veteran? Doesn't this comment reinforce that he's self-centered and not a team player? One thing I always try and do is avoid jumping to conclusions over comments players or coaches make in the press, because I think the way it works is that if we're happy with somebody, we will find the most generous interpretation possible for it. If we are unhappy with somebody, we'll figure out a way to get angry with them. And I think that that's what's happened with Wilson. I've heard a lot of criticism for this comment that, he was going to make life difficult on any veteran that came in here. And if Zach Wilson was, in a better spot right now, I think everybody would say, yeah, that's great. That's a great attitude. He's going in there to compete. And when when you're playing poorly, people take anything you say, and it will just, there's nothing, you never sound good when you're playing poorly, because people will take whatever you say and they're just trying to find a reason to be mad at you. And this is what happens with coaches too. I mean, Robert Saleh, he got criticized at the beginning of the year for the receipts talk, when he said, "Oh, we're keeping receipts." Then when the Jets had a winning streak, everybody was praising him. Everybody's like, "Yeah, that showed that he's showing everybody what he's showing everybody. He's getting the upper hand." And now that the Jets lost, the receipts comment's getting mocked again. Or, Jamal Adams is another good example where everybody loved him when he was playing great, then everybody hated him when he wanted to trade. It doesn't really matter. And these are the same people. They're essentially saying the same stuff. It's just a matter of whether you're happy with them or whether you're unhappy with them. And I think in this case, people are pretty down on Zach, so I think anything he said would be scrutinized. I feel like if Zach had said that, well, I'm going in to learn from this guy, I feel like if Zach had said that, they're going to bring in a veteran quarterback and I'm going to learn from him, I feel like there would be a contingent of Jets fans who would say, well, he should be more competitive. He should be talking about beating that guy out. I don't read a lot into this. I think Zach Wilson's been a major disappointment for the Jets. I do not have high hopes for him right now, but I don't think that these comments are really anything worth getting upset over. Our next question: the Jets finished in the top 5 in defensive rankings, but it feels hollow. I would rather have the Vikings defense, which is horrific, but knows how to get the key takeaway or stop when it matters the most. I'd rather have that than this paper tiger Jets defense. Is the Jets defense overrated, or are they what they are? I would not rather have the Vikings defense. See, I think this is what happens when you lose. There's an assumption that everybody's to blame. Just as when you win, there's an assumption everybody's responsible. A few weeks ago, this was back when the Jets had a winning record. I made a comment on my website that I would I was looking at offseason cuts, and I was thinking like I would lean towards cutting Jordan Whitehead, and it got a very negative reaction. And I think a lot of that was just the defense was playing well. So I think when the defense is playing well, there's an assumption that everybody involved is responsible for the defense playing well. And when the team's playing poorly, there's a perception that everybody's responsible for it. The defense was excellent this season. Now, bad, couple games against Jacksonville and Seattle, and bad play against Detroit, which lost them the game. But this defense was great during the year. The Jets. The only reason the Jets won 7 games this year is this defense. Or the biggest reason, I shouldn't say the only reason, but the biggest reason the Jets won 7 games this year is the defense. Because I took you through the teams at the bottom of the league in passer rating. The Jets could not throw the ball this year. That was their problem. And the Jets and the Steelers were the only 2 teams that aren't picking in like the top 10 who were at the bottom of the league in passer rating. The problem was the offense. And I think what's happened is the offense was so bad that it's essentially making people sour on the defense, because the perception is the Jets couldn't win games this year, so therefore the defense could not have been that good. The defense was really good this year. I would take this Jets. I would never take that Minnesota defense over the Jets defense. Jets defense was excellent this season. They took a huge step forward, I think. I cannot get on board with saying the defense was a paper tiger. Minnesota, if you want to talk a paper tiger, I mean, that would be the Minnesota defense, where they just kind of get fortunate in the key spots. That's not really a sustainable formula. What the Jets have done this year, I think, is going to be far more sustainable, and I think this defense is going to be quite good. I really like this defense moving forward. I think that they've got the pieces. If they can keep the core guys in place, they're going to be fine. That's all for our episode today. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you are watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source and enjoy the show, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the channel out and help other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.